There's light in the window. Table is spread in splendor. Someone standing by an open door. Yes, they're waiting. I can see that crystal river. It must be here forever. I've never been this homesick before.
I could see the bright light shine. It's just about home time.
And I can see my father standing by the door. This world has been a wilderness, oh yeah. And I'm ready for deliverance. And I've never been this homesick before. Well, I can see the family gather. The sweet faces are familiar. No one's old and feeble anymore. No, they're not. This old lonesome heart is just a crying. I want to spread my wings for flying. That's the rapture, folks. I've never been this homesick before.
I could see the bright light shine.
Oh yeah,
It's just about home time.
And I can see my father standing by the door. He wants me to come in. The world has been a wilderness, so yeah, I'm ready for deliverance. And I've never been this homesick before. Praise the Lord. Thank you so much. Good job, guys. Short-handed and all, we still pulled it off. Hey.
Can you hear me now? There we go. Woohoo! Now you can hear me. Any birthdays out there? Anybody? Right. Any birthdays? Nobody? Okay. So here we go then. We got a lot. We've had a lot the last few weeks, so here we go. Don't forget we have Bible studies throughout the week. So we have tonight at 6:30 at Brother Chris and Debbie's house. And then we have Tuesdays at 1 o'clock at Brother Mike's house. And Pastor Stacy's is at 7 on Tuesday. Then, of course, Wednesday we have Bible study and youth group here. Starts at 6:30. And then Thursdays at 10 a.m. on Facebook, we have J Sisters Bible Study. You can go and join that group and watch all the replays. And then a great big thank you to all of you that helped out Friday night, especially the men's home who rearranged this building and got it put together in no time, right? They did a fantastic job helping, serving, and everything as well. That was great. And then, of course, all the people that provided food. You guys are amazing. It was good, right? All the salads and everything was wonderful. And then, right? So that was awesome. Don't forget Men's Ministries is coming up on May 4th at 8:30 here at the church. And so there's that. And then we have a few other things coming up. We have the hometown citywide cleanup. That is Saturday at April 27th at 8 a.m. on Main Street. So go there. And then we have the pasta and bingo fundraiser for Peyton Arnold, the little boy we've been praying for. You guys all know this. He has leukemia. So they're doing a great big fundraiser that night at the Crossroads, May 2nd. That's from 6 to 8. And then if you can't make it or whatever, and you just want to donate to help out with the costs and stuff, you can do that. You can see Pastor D. And on the flyers hanging up everywhere, there's also people you can contact about that as well. And then ladies, of course, we usually meet the second Saturday of every month. But this Saturday, May 4th, the first Saturday of May, the Vernal Church is doing a women's conference. It's called Empowered Women. And it's from 10 to 3. And there's flyers hanging up everywhere, and there's some on the back table back there if you want to grab one to take home with you to hang it on your fridge so you don't forget. But it does cost $25 if you pay by the 20th. If you pay after the 20th, it's $35. But they have a whole breakdown in the time slots and everything of what's going on these flyers. So please go to that. That'll be awesome. They're talking about like the power of prayer and the Holy Spirit in your life and all sorts of wonderful things. So if you have questions on that, you can see Miss Brenda. She can fill you in on those details. I believe, yes, we are. We are still doing ours the second Saturday, which is at 11. And then also on Saturdays at 6:30, Miss Deb is up at the walking park up at Constitution. If you want to meet with her, and anybody can go, and they meet and pray, and then they walk, and then they pray afterwards and come home. So if you want to walk and pray, you can do that anytime, right? You don't have to go to the park to do it, but it's nice to do it when you're together, right? And to walk and pray. Just practice, you'll get it, I promise. It's easy. So there is that. I think I've got everything. All right, well, here you go.
All right, praise the Lord. Children's Church. You having children's church today or no? Yeah, okay. Children's Church, then, dismissed. I don't have the pulpit to hide behind, so this is going to be rough. But empowered women, does that mean you're going to teach them how to cook breakfast for men? Oh, excuse me. You got a problem right here, right now. I'm telling you right now. Yeah. That's what happens when you don't discipline your child. Like. Doc, where do you want to be? Right here, right? Right here. So we are so blessed to have our guest today. He's really not a guest. He's a regular. We have him twice a year. I think for the last 23 years, 24, almost 24 years, we've had him here pretty much twice a year, except when he tried to move to Texas. Now, he's from Oregon, but he's from a conservative little patch in Oregon, so he's all right. And speaking of Oregon, I want to introduce you to a couple of folks right here. Bob and Jackie Weaver right here, sitting right here. They're from Oregon, and they moved here to be closer to their grandchildren. So give them a big hand, right? Get to meet them. They're great folks. But they're also from a cool patch in Oregon, right? Right? Sort of, right? You guys are an enclave there. All right. What? Oh, he's got his mic. You don't need a stand anymore? Oh. Okay, be that way. Anyway, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this man. He's been a dear friend and one of the best creation speakers that I know of. There's a lot of people doing creation speaking. He's been doing it a long time and really coming up with incredible presentations, incredible evidence. And today he brought a bunch of microscopes, amen, for you guys to see some really cool stuff. So don't rush out of here today. You're going to see some cool stuff today. So Dr. Tom Kindell, he's just an amazing man and has great, incredible presentations every single time. So let's give it up for Dr. Tom. Yeah, that's fine. Is it on? It's on. All right. You're on. Okay. Let's dim the lights.
There we go. Well, it's always a blessing to be here with my friends and family in Roosevelt, and I wish I had time to say all the accolades for Pastor D, like he said for me, but I'll just say ditto. How's that? But today we're going to look at some fascinating evidence. If I can get it to come up here. It always works when we don't. There we go. There we go. Amber, an especially valuable jewel for creationists. We don't have it on the back monitor, however, so Might have to angle myself a little bit here so I can see it a little better. Now, amber is not wood sap. Amber is resin. Sap is a kind of a watery fluid that carries important nutrients and minerals toward the center of the trunk of the tree. But amber is deployed more around the edges of the tree, beneath the bark, and it's part of the defense and immune system of trees, especially coniferous trees, fir trees, pine trees, spruce trees. They have a lot of resin, and if you cut a gouge into it for perhaps like a tree fell and hit another tree and put a gash in its side, or if a tree limb broke off during a storm, this resin will ooze out and form a kind of a chemical bandage or a chemical scab that also has antibiotic or you know, the kind of chemical composition that is antiseptic. So microbes can't live in it, and it doesn't allow anything to get in, you know, like fungus to infect the tree. So it's kind of like a scab that's temporary there for the tree to heal itself. It will eventually, with reaction with oxygen, it will tend to granulate and dissipate. It'll eventually fall off onto the ground and weather into the soil. Yet we have vast amounts of amber trapped in sedimentary deposits, which we believe were laid down during the Great Genesis Flood, and because of pressure and heat, it has hardened so that it's no longer soft and sticky like it is when it originally comes out, but is hard enough to serve as a gemstone. Although it's not really a stone, it's not made out of crystalline mineral like regular gemstones, but it can serve as a gem, although somewhat of a soft gem compared to others. So there are many trees that exude resin. One of the best in the world is this kauri tree that we find in New Zealand. If you put a gash in it, you'll get a huge amount of resin to flow out of it. Possibly a tree like this produced the largest big, huge nugget, if you want to call it that, of amber that's ever been found. It was found in the Baltic region of Denmark in a coastal marsh, apparently thrown up into the marsh by a severe storm or perhaps even a tsunami. But it is estimated to have weighed about 2,600 pounds and was the size of a mid-sized car. So that's the biggest we've ever found, and it should have been put in a museum, you know, but it was cut up into little pieces to make gems out of it because obviously they could make a lot more money that way. But we believe trees like this may have been much more prominent in the world before the flood, and when the waves of the flood, the tsunamis, the blasting down of forests by volcanoes, and eventually the high-velocity currents sweeping over the continents would rip these forests out, and they'd be floating on the surface of the floodwaters in huge mats of vegetation that could literally cover thousands of square miles. Now, the kauri tree doesn't look all that tall. It's not as tall as the redwoods, but as you can see, compared to this young lady here, they're very wide in circumference and rival even the great redwood trees. Now, at Mount St. Helens, we have a kind of a microcosm of what we believe was happening during the time of the flood. There would have been immense volcanism. The blast force of Mount St. Helens has been estimated at least 10 to 20 megatons of a hydrogen bomb. It blew down, they estimate, nearly 1 billion board feet of lumber, and not that long after, they estimate there were about 1 million logs on the surface of Spirit Lake at the base of Mount St. Helens. Of course, this is what it would have been during the flood also. Volcanoes would be blasting down forests, tsunamis would be ripping them up, washing them out to sea, they'd be floating on top of the flood waters, and with the wind and the wave action, they'd be constantly banging and bashing into one another, cutting gouges that would release all this amber. Eventually, all the bark would be, broken off by all this constant battering on the surface of the water. So the scientific experiments have been done by evolutionists of all things, showing that the wood resin will remain soft and sticky much longer if it's submerged in water. When it's just exposed to the air, it tends to harden over time and then granulate and dissipate. But when it's in water, it stays sticky for a much longer time and it's pliable. So if we have all kinds of dead animals, insects, all kinds of things floating on the surface of the flood water, the wind and wave action would be banging these things into the amber. And this includes pockets of air, pockets of water, all kinds of insects and other animals, because it would be falling down onto the ocean bottom. It would also be able to entrap marine creatures, bottom-dwelling marine creatures, which we have found as well. So we believe that the formation both of coal and of amber in these sedimentary deposits was produced by these huge floating mats of vegetation. And as the vegetation got waterlogged and filtered down to the bottom, currents of water would bring in sediments that would then compact it. As it got deeper and deeper, it would get hotter and hotter. There are also geochemical means and geothermal means, namely volcanism, that would heat it, causing the carbonization of the coal. And it would also cause the wood resin to harden into hard amber. So you'd have all these floating on the surface, amber would be falling down. It's interesting that we find trees upright, just like we find at the bottom of Spirit Lake. They towed a sonar fish through Spirit Lake and found it had about 20,000 upright logs sitting on the bottom. They float down, they're a little more buoyant at the top than the bottom. Of course, their roots are broken off. You don't have a complete root system because they didn't grow there. But if we drained Spirit Lake, it would look like there's a forest of trees there, but they didn't grow there. They were transported there. And if you have flood currents bringing in sediments, then those sediments would build up and cover them relatively rapidly so that they would in fact fossilize. And that's why we find around the world upright trees going through layers of sediment and coal, showing that this coal that's supposed to have taken many millions of years for each layer to form, obviously was formed rapidly by heat and pressure. Experiments show that's all it takes. It can be done in a matter of hours to days, just with heat and pressure. It doesn't take a long time. And that's why we also find amber both in the coal as a byproduct of coal and in the sedimentary layers of rocks surrounding the coal. Now then, for thousands of years, the only known source of amber in the Western Hemisphere was from the Baltic region of Northern Europe, up here. I'll give you a close-up of it. Here we have the Baltic Sea, south of Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and it is primarily on the southern coast of the Baltic Sea that we find amber. Apparently, when the continents arose at the end of the flood, we had water draining through this channel here, cutting down to that layer that was rich in amber deposits. And also later, after the flood, we'd predict that there would be an ice age and glacial action could have cut down even further. So at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, we find that it has eroded down into this amber-rich layer. And because of that, because amber is light, it's lightweight, and if it has enough bubbles in it, and it frequently does have bubbles, if it has enough bubbles, it will actually float. And even if it doesn't have enough bubbles, it's very lightweight, so it can be easily moved along the ocean bottom by currents, and when there's a big storm, it can be thrown up onto the beach. So for thousands of years in the Baltic region, people have found amber washed up on the shore as they beach go. The ancients, especially those who worshipped the sun, thought these were tears of the sun that had fallen into the ocean and hardened, and so they valued them. They thought they were quite sacred. And because this was the only known region in the world to get it, it was considered a very precious gem. For a couple thousand years ago, it had incredible value, as we shall see. But it's still a semi-precious gem today, and there are still those who beach go on the Baltic coast looking for what they call Baltic gold, these beautiful amber gems. Now, usually you don't find that much unless it's after a storm, and even then it's fairly sparse. But you can wade out into the surf with these fine mesh nets that look like long-handled fishing nets, but they're actually designed to fish around in that surf. Because unless there's a storm to throw it up on the beach, it'll often just tumble around in the surf and not quite come up on the beach. But if you fish around with those nets, you can fish it right out of the surf. And that's what's been done. That's an old way of doing it that dates back hundreds of years. Here we have an old woodcut of peasants serving their lord, the landowner, and he would have them going out there fishing for that amber, because back at that time it was a very, very precious gem, so much so that the lords and noblemen had a law passed that lasted for centuries that if you were caught trespassing on an amber beach, it was the death penalty. And even if they didn't find amber in your pockets or in a bag or anything, just the fact that you trespassed was the death penalty. So they'd set up watchtowers to look up and down the beach, and they'd put a gallows right next to the watchtower where everybody could see. Any perpetrator would be hung out and left there, until the birds picked their bones and it's nothing but a skeleton. Pretty brutal times back then. But that law actually was in effect clear up until the 1700s because they so valued this gemstone. Now then, at the time of Emperor Nero in the first century, Emperor Nero was a terrible emperor for Rome, and he was especially a horrible persecutor of early Christians. But he fancied himself an artist. He loved artistry and artwork, and he loved jewelry, and he loved amber. And he is purported to have said that a single good quality amber carving, no bigger than a thumb, was worth the price of 2 healthy slaves. That's a lot of money back then. But prior to this time, more than 2,000 years ago, amber actually had an incredible value of a 200-to-1 weight ratio with gold. In other words, 1 pound of well-polished, well-carved amber jewels was worth 200 pounds in gold. So it was one of the most precious gems back at that time. Now we've found it all over the world because, as like coal, you'd expect during the flood it would be able to reform all over the world. And because it's mined actively in former Burma and in the Dominican Republic, in Mexico, and in other places around the world, even in New Jersey they found it, of all places. So it's not nearly as valuable as it used to be because of supply and demand. But we find it all over the world. The red squares are the older, what they claim to be older, around 100 million years, and the yellow ones are supposed to be 25 to 40 million years old, such as we have in the Dominican Republic. Now, when the movie Jurassic Park came out, there was kind of a spike in the price of amber because it again brought this jewel to public awareness. Because as you remember, the thesis of that movie was that a miner found this big chunk of amber with a well-preserved mosquito in it, and the mosquito's abdomen was red with blood because it had had a blood meal on a dinosaur. So they drilled in and extracted the blood and used the DNA to clone, supposedly, dinosaurs, from which we get Jurassic Park. Of course, even the evolutionists admit that's complete science fiction. They claim to have put it in amphibian eggs, but in reality, you'd have to put the DNA in a viable egg of a living species of the same type. Of course, we don't have any viable dinosaur eggs to put it in, and it certainly wouldn't work with amphibians. We're not only not the same species, they're not even the same class. They're the amphibian class rather than the reptile class. But it did bring amber to public awareness back then. Now, because it was so beautiful and so valued, the King of Prussia, he had an amber room built for his wife, the Queen, in Prussia, which preceded Germany in Europe. And he didn't get it completed, and it was supposed to have been completed by his son, who took the throne after his father died. But Frederick I didn't care about it, didn't want to waste any money on it, and so he took it and he gave it as a gift to curry favor with Peter the Great of Russia. And because he wanted to celebrate the fact that they had made an alliance against Sweden. Sweden was a major European power at that time. Now, Peter the Great was not just great because of his achievements. He was also great in stature. Does anybody know how tall he was? He was 6'6", which especially in his day was very tall. But although Peter and Catherine the Great liked the amber room and wanted to add to it and make a really huge and big and glorious amber room, they never actually achieved that. It was his daughter who did it. She hired an Italian artisan who was very familiar with cutting and using amber in artistry, and under her patronage, the amber room was made. It was moved to the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg. So if you ever get there, it's worth seeing the Catherine Palace. And it was put together with just incredible opulence and glory and luxury, 30-foot tall walls. They estimate it had so much Baltic amber that it would have weighed 13,000 pounds. And on the west end, you had these huge windows so that when the sun was setting low on the horizon, the sun would shine directly in against all this amber. And by all accounts, it was the most glorious, ethereal, amazing effect that the sunlight had on the amber. So the Russians considered this, quote unquote, their 8th wonder of the world. And so it stayed there at the Catherine Palace in all of its glory. It's quite a large palace there outside of St. Petersburg. And from an aerial view, you can see it's quite large indeed. It stayed there unmolested until World War II. When the Germans came invading with their blitzkrieg tactic, they came so quickly that the curators there at the Catherine Museum said, man, we don't have time to take this all down, put it in boxes and hide it under the ground or something. We've got to do something. So they tried to cover it up with wallpaper, but the Germans saw through that trick. And so they brought in a small army and they stripped that room bare in only about 1.5 days, put it in about 30-some large crates, and hauled it back to actually a part of Russia, Königsberg, and they put it in the Königsberg Castle. Now, this part of Russia had been conquered by the Germans. They thought they'd have it forever. But it was put on display in the Königsberg Castle, at least part of it, as, as a kind of a war trophy. But the fortunes of war had changed. By 1944, the Soviets were about to invade Königsberg, which today is called Kaliningrad, and that invasion was preceded by an aerial bombardment and an artillery barrage that heavily damaged the castle and set it on fire. Now, most historians believe that the amber was burned up in that fire. It is flammable. In fact, small pieces, too small to be useful for jewelry, have been burned for centuries as incense because it gives this beautiful, fragrant aroma of pine when it burns. So it's wonderful as incense. But apparently it burned up. Some claim that it was taken and hidden somewhere, but if so, nobody knows where that is. And it was claimed to have been maybe on a ship that sank in the Baltic Sea, but we have found that ship. Divers have looked all through it, can't find it. So if there was a category in the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest, the heaviest, and the most valuable work of art ever stolen and never recovered, this would be it. Modern estimates of its value is at a minimum $200 million to a maximum of close to $1 billion. That's where the estimates range. So it was a terrible disgrace to the Russians. Their eighth wonder of the world had been stolen and lost. So in 1979, under the administration of Leonid Brezhnev, the government authorized a replica of the amber room to be made with genuine Baltic amber. He never lived to see that. He died a few years later, and it took about 24 years for them to complete it. The artisans had to examine old black and white photographs trying to copy the artistry, and they couldn't afford to make it as big and opulent as the original. So they put it in a room at the Catherine Palace that had walls about 20 feet tall instead of 30. And so it's not quite as big and valuable as it was, but it's still rather spectacular. They worked so long on it because they didn't have enough funds to last, to have enough artisans to really get it done quickly, and they kept running out of money. Ironically, the German government, perhaps with pangs of conscience, donated Baltic amber as well as some money to actually help the project get completed. So it was completed, but they did have to skimp here and there, cut corners. The amber style was copied, but as you can see, it's somewhat thinner than it was in the original. So it's not as big, and the amber is thinner, but it was completed in 2003, and it was dedicated by Vladimir Putin there. He looked a lot younger back then. And it has been on display for the public ever since. And you can go, and if you get near St. Petersburg, it's worth taking a little drive out to where the Catherine Palace is. They use it sometimes for meetings, for press meetings and things of that nature. And although it's not as big, a lot of the opulence and glory and beauty of the original has been captured. And it is an awesome spectacle to behold if you ever get the chance. So amber has been valued for thousands of years as a beautiful gem. But it's an especially valuable gem for creationists because it acts as a chronometer, as a time clock that indicates these layers that they claim are, over 100 million years old in some cases, actually can only be thousands of years old because the amber itself and the fossils in them could not last anywhere near that long, based on proven experiments, based on proven science. Now, this actually makes it even more effective than the dinosaur soft tissue, proteins, and cell structures that we have found in dinosaurs. This is a big problem because, again, the thermodynamic experiments show that these type of biochemical compounds that we have in DNA and proteins, et cetera, should completely break down within just hundreds of thousands of years by thermodynamic disintegration of physical law. So Mary Schweitzer, who is actually an evangelical Christian, when she found this and published this in the early 2000s, we could see soft, stretchy blood vessels still intact, nucleated red blood cells still intact, proteins still intact. And this bothered her. She said, we've got to find a way to see how this could last for millions of years. Which is kind of ironic. I'm sure her atheist cohorts there at the university and the museum said, she could have said, well, here, God gets the last laugh. Here's this proof that these dinosaurs aren't the many millions of years old that you claim, that the flood is the best explanation for how they were preserved rapidly and recently. Therefore, the biblical history of this world is true, and this alleged long evolution of animals over time is just a fantasy, and the evidence of the fossils themselves proves it. This cannot last that long. But instead, she said, well, maybe iron from the hemoglobin in the red blood cells broke, the iron dissipated, and somehow preserved the tissues. Now, I don't know if anybody hardly agrees with that. Wheater's textbook on histology does not list iron as any kind of an effective preservative for tissues. Histology deals with biological tissue. Formaldehyde is, but even that wouldn't last that long, everybody admits. So it's kind of a hypothesis of desperation. But even though she's an evangelical Christian, because she believes in theistic evolution, that God used evolution as its means of creation, she's trying to get a way out of this, when really it's confirming God's literal interpretation. His literal statements in Genesis are in fact true. Now, this is Dr. Hugh Ross. He is a PhD in astronomy. He believes in the progressive creation theory that God took many millions of years. Each day of creation was billions of years long, and God took millions of years to create everything. So this bothered him too. He didn't want to accept it as, hey, we can accept the Bible for what it literally says. This proves it. This is science. No, he wanted to go against it also. So he said, if a sample is isolated from any exposure to bacteria and oxygen, then the soft tissue evidence easily can be preserved for over 100 million years. Well, that's his opinion, but science isn't based on people's opinion. It's based on what we can prove by experiments to be true. And the experiments, even done by the evolutionists for years, have shown even the toughest protein, which happens to be bone collagen, will not last for more than hundreds of thousands of years. When we take the decay rate and the temperature we project into the future, it just does not last that long. They might want it to, but the experiments show it doesn't. Now, his colleague at his ministry there, Dr. Fazil Rana, he's a PhD in biochemistry, so he's a little more knowledgeable in this area. My hat's off to him because he got saved out of Islam, which is not easy to do. But he is an evangelical Christian, but he also believes the earth is billions of years old. So he did not welcome this. We got to try to explain this away. We can't just accept that the Bible is right. God wins. No, so he wrote a book called Dinosaur Blood and the Age of the Earth, trying to explain how this could last so long when it really shouldn't. But he said collagen, or at least fragments of it, could survive 68 million years in an environment devoid of water, oxygen, and microbes, given its structure. Now, you notice Hugh Ross only listed 2. He lists 3 things that will break it down in much less than a million years. He says if you get rid of those 3, then it can last for many millions of years. Actually, there are 5 things that will break it down in much less than a million years. Does anybody know what the other 2 are? If you don't know, your ignorance is not by chance. It's because they don't want you to know and they don't talk about it. The other 2 are thermodynamic disintegration, a physical law that cannot be stopped and can be measured and can be extrapolated to show it won't last that long. The other is ground radiation. You see, most sediments are composed of particles of igneous rocks that contain minute amounts of uranium and thorium. And so when they're eroded, those little particles of sediment have uranium and thorium in them, and they emit irradiation. Now, the radiation is not real strong, it's mild, but the cumulative effect over several hundreds of thousands of years should be more than sufficient to wipe all this stuff out. And they don't like to talk about those last 2, because there's no way of eliminating those 2, and yet they are sufficient to wipe it out in just hundreds of thousands of years. Now, here we have Buckley and Collins. They've done a lot of work with archaeological sites in Great Britain, where you have the bones of man and the bones of animals. They took bone collagen, ran the thermodynamic tests to see how long it takes to break down. Their conclusion is it would take between 0.2 and 0.7 million years. In other words, between 200,000 to 700,000 years at cool temperature, 10 degrees Celsius, which is only 50 degrees Fahrenheit, for levels of collagen to fall to just 1%. In other words, 99% of it's gone in that short of a time. And notice he says in an optimal burial environment. What does that word optimal mean? It means no microbes, no oxygen, no water. So he says even if you exclude those three, thermodynamics alone breaks it down. In fact, they have gone so strongly as to say we have to reject this evidence in the dinosaurs. It can't be real, because if it's real, then our whole theory is destroyed. The fossils are too young to support the theory of evolution. But it's been published internationally now more than 122 times. It is real. They just don't have a good explanation as to how it should exist if it's as old as they claim. Now, it even gets worse, because on the left here we have Dr. Brian Thomas. He is a biologist. He got his PhD in paleobiochemistry. In other words, biochemicals found in ancient bones, like dinosaurs. Got it at the University of Liverpool in England. And he has used the most modern and the most effective instrumentation we have today, better than what Buckley and Collins had, nearly 15 years ago. It's the F-tier spectroscopy device, and it's able to measure with greater precision than anything we've had before. And as he points out on this chart here, they did numerous tests with this, and they all came back with the same result. Even the toughest bone collagen is breaking down at least twice as fast, or even more than twice as fast, as could be detected by Buckley and Collins. In other words, their upper limit of 700,000 years, you can cut in half to 350,000 years. That's for the toughest protein, the most resistant to thermodynamic breakdown. The other average proteins would only last about a third of that time, maybe 150 and 120,000 years. So the fact that they exist at all and in such excellent condition is prima facie, or face value evidence. They can only be a few thousand years old, dating back to the Genesis flood, which according to the biblical chronology was only about 4,500 to 5,000 years ago at the most. Now, Dr. Kevin Anderson, PhD in biology, he wrote a book on this, examining this evidence and talking with Dr. Rana, who holds to the old Earth position. He says, plus many documented examples of preserved tissue and proteins come from fossils in virtually bloodless settings. Remember, Mary Schweitzer said, well, the iron in the blood would take care of this problem, but now we've found all kinds of places where we have creatures with soft tissue and protein complexes intact, and there's no blood from the environment, and there's no iron from the environment either. So he says the preservation of dinosaur and reptile skin, preservation of a chitin protein complex in a beard worm. Now, that beard worm came from Cambrian age rocks that they date to be over 500 million years old, in excess of 500 million years old, yet it's still there. And a preservation of protein derivatives in the consortium of algae were certainly not a result of blood baths that soaked the biomaterial in hemoglobin. So he said, Mary Schweitzer never put her iron hypothesis to the test by putting it to the thermodynamic test and see if it would last for millions of years. That's what she should have done. She never did that. And I think because she didn't have faith in her own experiment. But this undercuts the whole argument. It's got to explain everything across the board, and if we have evidence where there's soft tissue and proteins where there is no iron, then that obviously cannot be the answer. He also said many of these dinosaur proteins, for example, hemoglobin, myosin, actin, and tropomyosin, are not nearly as structurally resistant to degradation as collagen. In fact, there is no experimental evidence that all these other proteins could survive for more than a fraction of the time that collagen can survive, and collagen can only survive by their own estimates, just hundreds of thousands of years. In the book Dinosaur Blood and the Age of the Earth by Dr. Fazal Rana, he mentions the ravaging effects of ground radiation, that thing you didn't know about and that they don't like to talk about, and even cites my challenge that no preservation model can counter the effects of radiation exposure over the course of millions of years. Yet he fails to offer any answer to this problem. You see, don't you think if they had an answer, they'd say, well, here's the answer and we can prove this answer by experiments. That's what a scientist should say. They just say, we all know that this has to be as old as we said. This is anomalous. We don't know what to do with this, but we know it can't disprove what we already believe. That is not a scientific position. No. science would never advance if you didn't allow your hypothesis to be falsified by evidence that shows it's false. How could you ever falsify evolution if they won't accept falsifying data? You can't have the advance of science in that type of mindset. Now then, other studies also challenge the iron model. Paleontologist Derek Briggs, who I believe is an evolutionist, cites results of a study where the addition of iron did not slow the decay of shrimp. Analysis of the Thescelosaurus vertebrae. This was a vertebrae of a Thescelosaurus dinosaur found in the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, supposed to be 68 to 70 million years old. And iron was present in some of the surrounding fossil, but virtually no iron was detected within the preserved tissue. Neither does this model or any preservation model protect the tissue and proteins from the ravages of ground radiation. So they have no experimentally provable answer to the thermodynamic decay problem and the ground radiation bombardment problem. But they're just sure it's got to be that old. And this evidence someday will have the answer. That's not a scientific position. They should say, well, we were wrong. But that's hard for people to admit, isn't it? Even Christians don't want to admit that they're wrong. Okay, so amber doesn't just trap, insects and arachnids. We have found birds. Here we have the foot and leg of a bird, this artist's reconstruction of what it would have looked like. Here we have the head and beak of a bird preserved in amber. Here we have lizards, found all kinds of lizards now in amber. Many of them look beat up, as you'd expect, being battered on the surface of the water if they're dead and floating on the water and getting bashed into the amber. Here we have one that was cut in half. His front foot is severed. But the rest of him, this is supposed to be, something like 50 million years old. You can still see the eyes, and this should have turned into dust in hundreds of thousands of years, yet there it is. And here we have one. This is very, very rare to find a complete one. This would be worth tens of thousands of dollars at auction. Here we have the shell of an extinct sea creature, an ammonite. And ammonite is in the same class as octopi, squid, cuttlefish, and chambered nautilus, that same basic taxonomic group, but it's extinct. But they found 40 different fragments or parts of different animals, including marine gastropods, which means marine snails, in amber. Of course, with this floating on the surface of the water, the resin falling down to the bottom where they're bottom-dwelling creatures, you would expect them to get stuck in the amber. So we have an ammonite as well as mites, spiders, millipedes, beetles, cockroaches, flies, wasps, sea slaters, and marine gastropods or marine snails. This is what the ammonite would actually look like with an artist's reconstruction. And what about the many other marine fossils found in amber? Here we have fossil barnacles, a marine isopod creature. We have a crab preserved in amber. And we have a marine snail and a trilobite. Now, a trilobite, they're supposed to have been extinct for about 500 million years. They're somewhat similar to the currently living horseshoe crab, which also is supposed to have been the same for hundreds of millions of years. It's still alive, still looks the same, didn't evolve at all in hundreds of millions of years. But the trilobites have gone extinct. Apparently they couldn't cope with the changes in the environment of the earth and the ocean after the flood. But they got trapped on the bottom as this resin fell down to the bottom off these floating logs. We get them trapped, as well as marine red algae, the kind that's found in the ocean. We also find in amber diatoms. What are diatoms? They're the glass houses or cell walls of single-celled plants, single-celled algae that extract dissolved silica, which is the main mineral component in glass, and they make these beautiful opalescent glass houses. I have some of those out there also that we can look at under the microscope. Again, something you would expect if this was floating on the water during the flood. Now we find all kinds of plant fossils in amber, and it's a ratio of about 16 to 1. For every 16 pieces of amber, you might find one with some plant material in it. When it comes to an animal, even if it's just an insect, it jumps to 500 to 1. Out of 500 pieces, you'll find one with an insect or some kind of animal. But what's the problem with finding all these plants beautifully preserved in amber? Plants don't have any collagen. We always want to talk about collagen, collagen, collagen as if it's magical. Yeah, it's tougher than most proteins, but the experiments show it doesn't last more than several 100,000 years. These would last even less. because they have no collagen. Insects have practically no collagen. Probably a fraction of 1% is collagen. They also should have broken down very rapidly. So we have all kinds of plants. Not only that, we can see the green chlorophyll still in them. That's a pigmentation polymer that selectively absorbs certain colors and reflects in one wavelength, in this case, green. That's why plants look green. They have those biological polymers called pigments. Well, that's still there, and you can see all kinds of bubbles in it. Bubbles have oxygen. Oxygen corrodes and oxidizes and would break this down. It should be shot through like Swiss cheese with all those bubbles on it. And here it says a flower bloom on a twig, but it's actually a flower bud. But you've got all this big bubble on there. Now we've drilled into amber more than 300 times and extracted the gases in these bubbles. And it turns out it's regular atmospheric gas, except it has a lot more carbon dioxide and oxygen than we have today. You know, the plant life and the animal life was flourishing back at the time this was put in the fossil record. And that's why you don't hear hardly any geologists saying, oh, we got to worry about the CO2 in the atmosphere. Back then, they admit it was 4 to 5 times as much as it is today. And it didn't cause any mass extinction or anything. But not only that, they've proven with these hundreds of samples that the oxygen content is between 29 to 31%, or in other words, about 30%. Currently, it's only 21%. So not only was there oxygen, it was a higher percentage than we have today. Oxygen is very corrosive. It causes steel to rust. It causes rubber to turn white and powdery. And it destroys things by decomposing them, by oxidation. Does anybody know a commonly seen example of very rapid oxidation? Very rapid oxidation. It's called fire. When something burns, it's an oxidative process that's happening extremely rapidly because at high temperature, oxidation is extremely efficient. At lower temperature, it still happens, but it happens in extreme slow motion. So that in several tens of thousands of years, half of this thing would have looked like you put a match to it and it burned into ashes and dust. That's how it should look, but it doesn't. The only way that could be is if it's only a few thousands of years old, dating back to the time of the Great Genesis Flood. Now then, insects preserved in amber are still glowing after 99 million years. Well, I don't think so. The shine and colorful skin on some bugs does not come from pigment, in other words, from those molecules, but it comes from tiny microscopic ridges, so microscopic you can't even see them without a microscope. But they're oriented in such a way to reflect only a certain wavelength of light. Very dark and deep, it makes it have this kind of shimmering, glowing, metallic shine to it. And we see this, of course, in various insects, and we see it in these insects, which are all in amber, that's supposed to be nearly 100 million years old. Well, the insects themselves should have fallen into dust by thermodynamic disintegration, and these that have bubbles on them should have fallen even quicker by oxidation, yet we have this glowing color. Why? Because they're glowing with youth. If they're even several tens of thousands of years old, those ridges would have disintegrated, and there would be no such color available. Now here we have what is supposedly the world's oldest mosquito found in amber. They date this supposedly to be 130 million years old. Yet you look at the delicacy of it. I mean, look at all the delicate fibers here on the antennae. All still there. That's so thin and delicate, that would have fallen into dust very quickly. A few tens of thousands of years, there'd be nothing there but dust. Look at the eyes with all these lenses, the delicate ommatidia. Looks like somebody poured liquid lucite in it and, allowed it to dry overnight, and it looks like it was done yesterday. It could not be in this good a shape unless it was very, very young. Here we have a termite. This is from my own private amber fossil collection. And amber jewelry, the conversation piece for creation evidence, that's why I've taken to wearing amber rings, because people notice that and say, oh, what is that? Well, that's amber. This particular amber is supposed to be 99 million years old, but neither the amber nor the little flying bug in it could survive that long. It's like a time capsule that tells us that the rocks these were buried in, the sedimentary layers, they were laid down only thousands of years ago, because this would not exist if it's as old as they claim. So we often get bubbles in amber, and these bubbles often get on both plants and animals. But it's not just air bubbles, also pockets of water with air bubbles inside the pockets of water. And this, of course, we would expect with these logs being on the surface of the ocean water being bashed and battered into each other, it would knock pockets of air and water right into the soft resin, which later hardened and contained it. So these are the sepals at the base of a flower. When it's a bud, the sepals cover the bud completely. And here we have a large water anhydro, in other words, a packet of water with moving air inside of a sepal of a flower. So here we have, this looks like a bubble here with a lighter colored bubble inside of it. But the bigger bubble is actually a pocket of water with an air bubble in it. Therefore, if we turn it upside down, this air bubble should move this direction if we turn it upside down. And when we do, we see the air bubble has moved upward from where it used to be here, showing that we have not only air bubbles here, but water and air directly contacting this. Now, what's known as the universal solvent? Water, H2O. It has a hydrolytic effect that tends to break apart molecules. It breaks down or is a solvent to more different types of chemicals than any other known solvent. That's why it's called the universal solvent. That's why they always say we've got to get rid of oxygen, which oxidizes, we've got to get rid of water that breaks things down. Well, here you have both. This is supposed to be 99 million years old. Why does it exist? Good question. Many of these bugs, of course, have bubbles directly contacting them. You can't see it quite as clearly here, but notice here, bubbles on its back, bubbles on its side, bubbles on its underside. Beautiful ommatidia and its antenna, beautifully preserved. Thing's supposed to be 42 million years old. Here we have a mosquito. This is one out here that you can take a look at. It has a bubble on its side and a bubble on its shoulder. Let's take a close-up there. See the hairs sticking out of the bubble? See, the bubbles don't pop when they're in amber, because just like in honey, they're so well supported by the thickness that they don't pop. They can be squeezed into different shapes, but they don't pop like they will in water. So we see, again, the delicate eye structure. And what's this? We see a number of bubbles here, but a large bubble has encapsulated this creature. What is that creature? I haven't found anybody yet that knows. Well, it's an aphid, a little aphid, completely surrounded in a bubble, and yet you can still see it. It hasn't oxidized into dust. It's supposed to be 42 million years old. Here we have a spider, largely encapsulated with bubbles, reverse angle, we can see also on the underside. It should have been oxidized into oblivion, but there it is. And here we have a spider with many bubbles on its legs. When we get a close-up of it, we can see that even its head and thorax and its abdomen are all encased in bubbles, and yet they're still there. We get a close-up there, we can see the hairs of the abdomen are still there. They should have oxidized into dust in just tens of thousands of years. This is supposed to be 42 million years old. This spider, we can see the hairs on its abdomen. The hairs on its legs are encapsulated in bubbles, but they haven't oxidized. This big leg is encapsulated in a big bubble, but even the tiny hairs on it are still there. Oxidation should have destroyed them, burned them into dust within a few tens of thousands of years, but they claim they know it's 42 million years old. And here we have a fly with a big bubble on its back, but what's this over here? Entirely encapsulated within its own bubble. It looks like a spider, but it's not. It looks more like a tick, but it's not. It's something much smaller. It's a mite. And mites tend to have hair on their bodies, whereas ticks don't. When we take a close-up of this, you can see the hairs sticking out of its rear of its abdomen and on its legs. I have this one out there that you could look at directly with the microscope and see with your own eyes. This is real. See, I bring microscopes with the amber fossils because the younger generation is kind of jaded. When you put something that looks cool on the screen, they say, well, that could have been put together by computer-generated imagery. We see that all the time in the movies. It's not real. Yeah, well, this you can see and touch and look at with your own eyes. It's real. And the fact is, it shouldn't exist if the geological record and fossil record is as old as they claim it is. Now here again, we have bubbles of water with air bubbles inside. So when you tilt these back and forth, the air bubble moves inside the pocket of water, just like on a carpenter's level. And here again, because the amber is being bashed and struck while it was soft, often the bubbles are misshapen. the bubbles of water, that is, but the air bubbles, of course, remain round. When we turn that a different direction, the bubbles go in a different direction. So this is frequent, and we find it in amazing places, like in this case, moving water bubbles in an ant from Dominican Republic amber. I don't have all the sequence of this. I had others that I misplaced. I have them in my computer, though. I'm going to put them in. When you move this ant back and forth, up and down, this bubble moves back and forth inside its abdomen. So you have water and oxygen directly in contact with it. It should have dissolved by oxidation and hydrolysis within just tens of thousands of years. It's supposed to be 25 million years old. Now this is a different ant that also has that same feature. Okay, you see the bubble there? It's a little dark, a little hard to see. But that's with the ant's head tilted down to the right. If we tilt the ant's head up, then theoretically this bubble should move toward the right, over here. Does it? Yes, it does. Because water is inside the ant's abdomen and oxygen, and it shouldn't exist. But it gets worse. 40-million-year-old DNA, which is much more subjected to thermodynamic breakdown than even proteins. Now, Kano, who is an evolutionist microbiologist at California State Polytechnic University, dissected a Dominican stingless bee trapped in 25 to 40 million-year-old amber, found bacterial spores, a dormant state of bacteria. Now, when bacteria sense the environment is getting harsh, it kind of folds up, has a protective covering, and it goes into a state of hibernation or suspended animation. Its metabolism slows down to almost zero, and it can last a long time in that state. Not for millions of years, not even for hundreds of thousands of years, but it can last a long time, perhaps thousands of years. Well, he was able to get them out of their dormant state, has grown them, analyzed some of their DNA, and found it closely matches the same bacteria found in modern Dominican bees. Well, of course it would. They're only separated by thousands of years, not many millions of years. But the big question is, how can you have viable DNA after millions of years when it breaks down faster than any protein? Gets even worse. 45-million-year-old brewer's yeast still works. So the Stumptown Brewery in Guerneville, California, brews its beer according to a unique formula. They were able to extract yeast cells out of amber, found they were viable, they got them to grow, and of course once they grow they multiply very fast and you have all you want. And so they have this big advertising campaign, come and taste what beer would have tasted like 45 million years ago. Of course, everybody says it tastes like beer today. Gee, I wonder why, because it's the same yeast. How in the world did it survive and still be viable after 45 million years when everything should have broken down in just hundreds of thousands of years? Yeah, this is extremely powerful evidence that these rocks that they're found in cannot be millions of years old, but only thousands of years old. So DNA should be gone. Now, back in the 90s, Scientific American magazine would publish things like this. Now they don't like to talk about how fast things break down. They especially don't like to talk about ground radiation. But back here they did. Certain physical limits seem inescapable. In approximately 50,000 years, water alone strips bases from the DNA. Oxygen also contributes to the destruction of DNA. Even in ideal conditions, in the absence of water and oxygen, and at low temperature, background radiation must finally erase all genetic information and all protein information too. Well, they don't make admissions like this anymore because they don't want you to know about it. But back in the 90s, they did. So if you were to enter into a room and somebody says, we're ready to certify that nobody has been in this building for more than a year, but you notice a still steaming hot cup of coffee and a still burning cigarette, would you have reason to doubt their statement? Of course you would. Common sense, common experience shows you somebody's been in here very recently. But what if they have a strong ulterior motive to deny the obvious truth? Say they are a security company, and this big corporation said, we're going to hire you as our security team if you can prove that you can keep this building from having any trespassers for over a year. And if you do, we'll not only give you a contract, we'll give you a big bonus. And so they set up their security cameras, they had their guards, and they were ready to go in and certify it, but they found this. One of the honest members of the team said, oh, you know what we forgot to do? We forgot to use ground-penetrating radar to check for tunnels. Obviously, there must be a tunnel It comes up into a secret passage, probably behind one of these big bookcases, and somebody was in here and heard us coming and slipped out of that secret passage and down the tunnel. That would make infinitely more sense than to say, this has been like this for over a year. What would be the more reasonable hypothesis? Well, obviously, they didn't do their due diligence. There must be a tunnel. There must be some way to get in there undetected, because this doesn't last very long. But if they're sufficiently motivated, they will say, look, the media listens to us. We are the experts. The science magazines listen to us. We can say what we want, and they bow down before us. So we just need to have our story straight. We'll all stand foursquare and say, nobody has been in this room for over a year. We're ready to certify it, and we, the majority of experts, are always right. Any gadflies that disagree, well, they're not the experts, are they? So don't even listen to them. Well, when they're asking you to ignore common sense and obvious truth, they have an agenda. And what's the agenda in evolution? The only show in town is to get rid of God is evolution. And if you destroy the very foundation of evolution, that their fossil record that's supposed to show millions of years of time in evolution is young and was produced, like the Bible says, by recent catastrophic burial by the great flood of Noah, that destroys their whole worldview right there. They'd have very strong emotion and very strong reason to reject obvious evidence. But just as surely as this shows, someone was there very recently. The amber fossils, even more than the dinosaur fossils, because of the presence of oxygen and water, show they cannot be very old. They're chronometers that disprove what they want to believe. But of course, the media won't listen to us. The textbooks won't put it. The universities won't teach it. But you know in your own hearts, when there's evidence like that, you have the truth. God has given us the truth in these last days. We don't have to be intimidated. They're the ones rejecting truth because of their motivation to do so. So, in conclusion, I quote the first century Roman poet, Marcus Martial. He said, "A drop of amber from the weeping plant fell unexpected and embalmed an ant. The little insect we so much condemn is from a worthless ant become a gem." And that's so true. If you have an ant or some other insect in amber, it's worth a lot more than just a regular piece of amber with no plant or no animal in it at all. But it's especially valuable for creationists because it gives us that chronometer that tells us their interpretation of geology, their interpretation of the fossil record cannot be true. The evidence is overwhelming. In conclusion, we'll look at the amber room because it speaks of glory and beauty. It's a spectacle to behold. It's a delight to our eyes because being made in the image of God, we by nature appreciate beautiful things. But God has promised a promise in Revelation that we will inherit the city of God, the New Jerusalem, far more glorious than the amber room could ever be. And because amber has proven that God's word is true in Genesis, we can surely have confidence to believe God's word is true in Revelation, where we have that promise that the eternal heavenly city, the New Jerusalem, comes down out of heaven to the renewed earth, a new earth where there's no more sorrow, no more sickness, no more pain, no more tears, no more curse, and no more death, for the former things are passed away. And the scripture says, "Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he shall dwell with them and be their God, and they shall dwell with him and be his people. And we will love God and love one another for all eternity, which is the purpose of life, according to the Bible." And in that city, more glorious than this, there'll be 12 different gemstones in its foundation, a wall of pure jasper. Pure jasper is blood red. And it's a symbol that to come into that eternal abode with God, you must pass through the blood of Christ. The gates are made out of pearls that are white. The white represents the righteousness of the saints. And in that city, the buildings and even the streets will be made of the highest refined gold, so pure you can see through it. It'll have a golden hue, but clear as crystal. Something far more glorious than anything man could make. Yet amber has proven God's word is true in Genesis, and we should believe the promise in Revelation, because that is the true and good news of Jesus Christ, the gospel. Amen. Okay. Thank you very much. Pastor D, will you close us out?
Yeah. Do it up. That's great stuff. Praise the Lord. It's so good to have this because you can turn up the lights, Jimmy. Otherwise I'll fall on something. But the reason why we have this is because not only do you need to know this and kind of understand it, that the evidences for creation, for God's purposes and everything are so clear, but you need to be able to pass it on to your children and to your grandchildren, because they're learning. There's an agenda out there that's going completely opposite. There's not accepting this at all. Clear evidence is not accepting any of it. So they need to be strong, maybe not start arguments in the classrooms or anything like that, but they need to be strong and stand up for what they really believe in. So you need this. You need the videos that he has back there that you can purchase, because it'll really help you not only to educate yourself and to build your faith even stronger, but also to be able to combat the attacks on our youth that are coming our way constantly. So it's extremely important. We're going to take an offering for the furthering of the kingdom. Dr. Kindell, I always get Kindell, it's Kindell, goes all around and teaches this kind of things. Many, many different presentations that you'll see in the video table back there, that you'll be able to understand that very valuable to get this information into people's hands. And so we want to further the kingdom. So if I get a couple of people to come up and take an offering real quick. Gary Smith, can you come up?